So, John, it's been a couple of years since we connected,
Right.
and is this podcast going to be controversial, John?
If you're a horse advocate, probably.
Oh man.
I guess the only thing I'm trying to do is get information that's credible out there to the public at large, so they understand the complexities of what wild/feral horses are causing in our habitat and our environment all across the West.
John, it's weird that you say that because, we're engaged in all sorts of things, all sorts of wildlife management issues all over the world.
Correct.
And there seems to be this general rhetoric right now that is, it's a sentiment that is a hands-off sentiment. Mother Nature's going to take care of herself, regardless of whether it's an invasive species or not, whether it was native there or not. Humans, man, should not play a role in management. Replace horses with wolves. Replace wolves with elephants. It is the same. But we're here to talk about horses.
Well, yeah. And in Arizona, or in particularly across most of the United States, horses don't have a natural predator.
So before we go any further, John Koleszar, welcome to the Blood Origins podcast. This is your first time on the Blood Origins podcast. I don't think it's going to be the last if we're getting into this whole wolf debate now. Horse debate.
Horse debate, yeah.
Introduce yourself, John.
Okay, my name's John Koleszar. Lived in Arizona for almost 40 years now. Been active in conservation efforts in Arizona for the last 37 years. Started out working banquets and then joined various other groups and organizations. I'm currently president of the Conservation First USA, commonly known as the Arizona Big Game Super Raffle.
And that's where we met each other.
Yes, it is. At the banquet. Yep.
So, John, dare I ask such a pointed question, but this is the Blood Origins podcast, and that's what we're known for.
Okay.
What makes you a horse expert, John?
I guess because I became so heavily involved after what was called the Rodeo Chetasky fire here in Arizona.
Okay.
It happened to hit in an area where my partner had a cabin. She and her parents lived there. And after the fire came through, I had hiked and hunted in that area prior to the fire.
Okay.
I'm an avid elk hunter. I do shed hunting in the spring, all through the summer, and then hunt elk when I get drawn in the fall or help people who have tags in the fall. And during the previous 14 years prior to the Rodeo Chetasky fire, I had never seen a horse in the wild. And then after the Rodeo Chetasky fire, all of the fences between the White Mountain Apache tribal lands and the Sitgreaves National Forest came down. And they couldn't rebuild those fences for a period of about 5 years because of all the deadfalls that would occur each winter. And it was a useless effort because they'd come back in 2 weeks and they'd all be down.
And the fences came down because of the wooden staves that were holding the fences. They burnt out, essentially?
Correct. And a lot of trees fell and they were smashed in the efforts to save some of the land.
Gotcha.
And so there was a lot of ingress and egress, mostly ingress by the tribal horses onto the Sitgreaves National Forest. And then the forest, and I kept mentioning it to the wildlife officials, and I'm friends with a lot of the game and fish officials here in Arizona. And I kept mentioning, there's all of these horses suddenly are coming in. They're coming up from all over the place from the reservation. They said, yeah, the Forest Service is going to round them up. Well, the Forest Service attempted to do that back in 2005. The horse advocates, however, filed a lawsuit in federal court because, unbeknownst to most people, in 1973, when they passed the Wild Horse and Burro Act in 71, every forest had to decide if there were any horses in their forest. And at that time, there were 7 horses in the Sitgreaves portion of the forest, none on the Apache.
Okay.
And so they set aside 19,000 acres for a wild horse territory for those 7 horses. Well, unfortunately, they died off. There was no stud available at that time in the wild, and so they all died off roughly 1994, 1995. After the Rodeo Chetiskyi fire, all these horses came in. And since 2005, when the Forest Service attempted to round them up and the horse advocates filed lawsuits, the federal judge in 2007 determined that they needed to have a management plan because they were now inhabiting a wild horse territory and therefore were deemed wild. And it's all semantics at that point because we know where they came from. We knew that they were from the White Mountain Apache tribe, but nobody could prove it. You couldn't prove that they are not the long lost descendants of the Spanish conquistadors.
Okay.
So for the last 17 years, the Forest Service did not perform their duties. And only by urging
and their duties were
to manage the forest for a sustainable population of all wildlife.
Okay.
And you cannot sue the Forest Service for not doing their job. That's one of the beauties of being a government job. You can't be sued for not doing your job. And I've gone through 4 forest supervisors, and the most recent one, Rob Lever, and before him, there were a couple, Judy Palmer and Anthony Madrid. Those were the previous 3. They were the ones who finally got the ball rolling in terms of removing horses. So they did that.
So horses have been removed
they
from
were
the
removed
Siskiyou.
from one section of the forest. It's called the Apache-Sitgreaves. And
Sitgreaves, yeah.
Yeah, the Sitgreaves they have not been, the Apache they have. And just recently, the Forest Service finally, after 17 years, came out with their management plan, and they want to reduce the number of horses from approximately 1,500 down to less than between 50 and 100 horses. That will set off a firestorm with the horse advocates, and we know that already.
And I've stayed clear of the horse narrative for quite some time until Charles was like, you need to talk to John. And I was like, okay. What is the argument from the horse advocates to reduce numbers? Why do they say you don't need to? Or why are they against it?
They feel that the horses are wild and should have a place in the forest, and that even though they're non-native, because they're a cultural, iconic symbol of the West, they want to have them there. And part of the misnomer and misinformation is that they claim there's not enough horses. And every politician you talk to will say, well, there's 82,000 plus horses in the West. That's not true. There are 82,000 on BLM lands, but that does not include tribal lands, does not include state trust lands, does not include national forests, does not include
private lands.
Sanctuaries, private lands, yeah. Realistically, and I looked it up because I get more and more involved with it. The Journal of Science Management pointed out 3 years ago that their conservative estimate is there's over 300,000 horses across the United States today in the wild, predominantly in the West. There's a couple spots on the East Coast, Assateague Island in Maryland. They have a small group, but each year they either fertility control or they raffle and auction off some of them to keep the herd size manageable. Here in the West, there hasn't been that effort. And the horse advocates claim that, well, cattlemen are the cause for the degraded habitat. But I know that as a sportsman, I've helped raise millions of dollars through auctions and raffles for wildlife and for wildlife habitat. And now in Arizona, we're seeing a dramatic decrease in the number of hunting permits because there's no forage available and water. And when you look at water in Arizona, it's like gold out here. And most of the dirt tanks that we have were installed by cattle ranchers or the Game and Fish Department. They're called catchments. Mm-hmm. That's the only available water, consistent water year round. Horses will dominate any one of those places. A stud will keep his band close to a dirt tank, and they will drive off any other form of wildlife. Nothing will get in the way of that stud when he's trying to drive. He will drive off people.
What do the horse advocates say to impacts to the forest or impacts to other wildlife?
They deny it, or they claim that it's the cattle ranchers who have the responsibility for the degraded habitat.
Do
And
they believe more horses is better, right? There's
yes, they do.
no sense of management. There's no sense of like, there's no upper limit. More
No,
the better.
no. I was really active 3 years ago when they started removing them from the Apache National Forest, which is the sister forest on there's only a city in between the Apache and the Sitgreaves. And I was very active. And Robin Silver, who is the co-founder for the Center for Biological Diversity, he and I sat at we had a collaborative on our Salt River horses, and we became friends. And he was the sole reason why the horses were removed from the Apache, because number one, there was no wild horse territory designated by Congress. And number two, they were degrading the sensitive habitat for the New Mexico jumping meadow mouse, which is an endangered
Did you say the
species.
Center for Biological Diversity?
Yeah, I know Robin very well.
And okay, so let's just pause for a second for context.
Mm-hmm.
Center for Biological Diversity is typically not on the side of hunters and hunting organizations.
It depends on the situation. In
Okay.
many situations, he and I go round and round about having wolves that were imported from Canada to replace the wolves that we had once here in the United States, which were much smaller. But we agree to disagree on that. But on horses, in an endangered species, we can agree to some degree.
Well, it makes sense from CBD because in their name, Center for Biological Diversity, they would be all for biological diversity.
Correct.
And one species dominating a system, being overabundant in a system, typically is not good for biological diversity.
No. And that's how we came to agree.
Does CBD still sit in that position today?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
They're thrilled. We keep in contact every time there's some form of litigation. We co-joined him on a litigation here in the Valley, suing the Salt River Wild Horse Management Group for having too many horses in a 19,000 acre area. They have over 300 horses in that 19,000 acres, and it's denuded the habitat. They have to feed supplemental feeding every year, and it requires thousands of bales of hay or alfalfa to be brought in to feed them. It's artificial. The horses have become habituated, and it's a dangerous situation, but people like to see them.
Now, remind me again, the Forest Service cannot remove horses because they get sued?
What's happened is that they were sued in 2005 on the Sitgreaves National Forest because they wanted to remove 500 horses. And the judge said, come up with a management plan. Yeah, you're going to probably remove horses, but you don't have a management plan. There hasn't been any input from the stakeholders. And so they held a collaborative where everybody got together, and it broke off finally in 2018. The wild horse advocates didn't want any horses removed. And all the other parties to it said, yeah, you have to remove and leave somewhere between 50 and 100 horses. They came through with their biological assessment and all that paperwork that goes into it, and it's years in the making. But they finally published it about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And that's the crux of what's going to happen going forward.
That's what I got sent, is this extensive, comprehensive management. And that makes sense, right? From the judge's perspective, going, I don't have anything to judge this off of. It's their opinion versus the scientist's opinion. Obviously, we could agree to disagree whose opinion is better in a scenario when it comes to wildlife management. But the judge said, give me a management plan. Give me a comprehensive management plan of the effects of what's happening and how you remedy those effects. And that's essentially what I've been sent.
Yes. Now, the key is, though, that the horses, instead of being in 19,000 acres, which was their designated territory, now occupy over 400,000 acres. There's a 50-mile stretch where you can find horses almost any day. And it's sad because instead of elk crossing signs or deer crossing signs, you have horse crossing signs. And
they've put horse crossing signs on the road?
Yes. Yes.
It physically looks like a horse?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's ludicrous. If you brought back somebody who hadn't been here in 50 years and you said, here it is now, they go, what is that? What do you mean horses? Where's the elk and the deer? It's just everything's changed. And it's because of the advocacy that the horse lovers have and the pressure that they've placed on the government, as well as the individuals who are operating the Forest Service. I've done in-depth readings. I'll give you a question. If you answer this, and I'll be really, really thrilled. How much money have we spent in taxpayer dollars in the last 5 years for the Wild Horse and Burro Management Act by the Bureau of Land Management?
Well, I think I looked up the number, and I may be way off base here, or maybe quite close to it. Isn't it something along the lines of like 120 million a year?
Over the last 5 years, we've spent over $500,000.
Oh, so I'm way off.
500 million, excuse me.
Then I was about to say, John, I thought I was pretty close. And
you were close. You're very close
good.
on an annual basis.
Good.
Now, that does not include any of the lawsuits, the lawyer costs, and everything else that goes into all the fighting and the bickering that goes on between the horse advocates and any attempts at removals. And when you consider that you have the big number that everybody uses is the 73,000 horses, well, that's not true. They have over 50,000 in horse hotels right now that nobody will adopt. They're sitting there waiting for adoption. The government will pay you $1,000 to take a horse from the horse hotels.
How many of the horse advocates? There's probably a couple of repeat offenders that you see all the time, right, John?
What do you mean in terms of who's
the people who, they show up to meetings.
Oh yeah.
They send emails. Do we know how many of those people own horses from the roundups?
Not from the roundups, no. I mean, I know like the Salt River Management Group here, they have a really strong following because the uneducated people here in the valley love to see horses when they go down the Salt River. They don't understand, however, that it's not a natural occurrence, that there's too many, that they are being fed. So there's a following, and the one leader here is a media darling. The local media love to talk to her, and they don't like talking to us because we're for removal, and they're for these beautiful, majestic animals that look so wonderful out in the water. I get that, and it is true. I mean, I've owned horses. I've bred them. I've had them boarded. I've been ridden with them. I've been thrown. I've been bit. I've been stomped, everything. But they're a gorgeous animal, but they have a place. Everything has a place. And it's a balance that we're trying to find, and it's just not available now.
John, in this comprehensive management plan, is there a documentation of the change in elk and deer numbers over time?
They did not look at that. However, the Arizona Game and Fish Department has. And a good example is 10 years ago in the one particular unit or hunting unit, there were 625 deer tags available, and they harvested 130 bucks. That was 12 years ago. This year, the total number of tags allocated for that unit was 130. Wow. So it's declined by 80%. Now, I had an elk tag in that unit just a month and a half ago. And one day we rode from what is called the 300 road, which butts up to the Indian Reservation, out to the main town, which is Overguard. It's a 9-mile stretch. And in that 9-mile stretch, we counted 70 horses. There were hardly any elk. There was no sign. And we hiked miles looking for it. But every dirt tank, every water hole, every catchment, every place that we could find, there were stud piles. And a stud pile, of course, is the lead stallion's indication that this is my turf, don't you dare come near it. And they were driving people and anything off. So basically, the elk are staying more on the reservation side or evacuating to another area. They're moving out because there's no forage available.
John, what is you said that there's an Indian reservation, the fence that came down. What is that Indian reservation? That's the Apache?
It's the White Mountain Apache Tribal Nation.
So what is the White Tribal Nation's viewpoint or opinion on wild horses on the landscape?
Would you like their published version?
No, I want the truth.
It depends on who you talk to. The tribes, some people in the tribe love the horses. Some people in the tribe, if you're hunting on the reservation and you happen to have a tag and you have a Native American tribal guide, they'll tell you to shoot one if you see it.
Mm. Mm.
And they use it as bear bait.
Mm.
Now, the big claim that there's only 73,000 wild horses left in the West, we know that there's over 70,000 on the Navajo Indian Reservation in the four corners of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. And they're starving. There are a lot of shepherds in the Navajo Reservation. They're sheep herders, and they don't have any forage left. They were going to offer a hunt for the horses, but the public input screaming put that to a halt, so they didn't hold the hunts. That was a few years back.
John, the idea that the horses are eating themselves out of house and home, you would think that would resonate with the horse advocates, in which they see pain and suffering being delivered to this thing that they love so much.
Well, here's the key. Because when they started, this is a huge territory, 500,000 acres. As they've grown in numbers, horses are nomadic. They move, they breed, they break bands apart, new bands form. And it started with a central spot, and then it just expanded like this all the way across the whole forest. Now they're going, and there's a 50-mile stretch, which should be 19,000 acres, which is basically a few miles each direction, is now 50 miles. So they haven't starved yet. If we have a drought like we had this, in the last few months, if we have a drought summer, they'll have to be hauling water and food because they will have a huge die-off.
But maybe that's the experience in Arizona, but I've seen places elsewhere, like in Nevada and whatnot, where they are essentially eating themselves out of house and home. They
have. Yes, they have. And down in the desert, if you see them in the desert, they are eating themselves out of house and home. There's no question.
It's funny. I'm busy finishing a documentary coming out of Spain there was a hunting ban put on a national park in Spain. The interesting component of this national park is half of it is private land. Mm-hmm. So the government said to these private landowners, you're not allowed to hunt anymore. End of story. Well, it's a high fence property, and everyone knows, well, I guess everyone doesn't know, that when you do not hunt a high fence property, those animal populations are only going to incrementally increase. Yep. And when they incrementally increase, they're going to eat themselves out of house and home.
Yep.
And I interviewed a professor, a professor of forestry engineering in Madrid, and he had this incredible statement, and I need to learn it verbatim, but I'm going to sort of just paraphrase it. He said, the greatest perversion on animal welfare is for people to not manage animals.
Yep. They're loving them to death.
The greatest perversion. It was just the way that his wording, it was just unbelievable. Yeah, they're loving them to death.
Yeah.
So we've now got, what are we talking now? 2005 is when the suit came to be. 13 years it took to develop the management plan. We're sitting in 2024 now. So now we're almost 20 years to the day.
Mm-hmm.
No horse management's happened in 20 years, right?
Not a bit.
Not a single ounce.
Not one iota.
So what happens now?
Now, the only way that I think that's publicly...
Is that judge still in office to give him the management plan?
No, what's happened is they fulfilled their management plan. They have done everything that they're required to do by the federal decree, and it may be challenged in court by the horse advocates. And it probably will be,
of course,
because they don't want a horse removed.
So the management plan is going to be challenged.
Oh, I would bet 99% that it's going to be challenged. Yes.
Yeah. So that means, depending on the court system and whatnots, and
5 more years,
another couple of years before any horse management occurs.
Now, the beauty of the way these horses are now is that passive trapping is extremely easy to gather them. And we do it all the time. That's how we've been gathering the horses on the Apache.
So not on BLM?
Nope. This is all national forest.
Okay, maybe I'm not following correctly. So I thought BLM were not allowed to take horses
BLM
off.
handles their issues. The national forest, which is where the Apache and the Sitgreaves are, is a whole separate entity. And
But
so
that's where
they
this
have,
management plan is.
yes, this management plan is only for the Sitgreaves National Forest.
But you are already managing horses on the Sitgreaves.
We're managing them on the Apache. The Apache, they
Shit.
were determined to be feral horses.
Oh, gotcha. So nothing's happening on the Sitgreaves, but on the Apache you are. You're passively rounding them up and sending them away.
Yep, we've removed over 600 already.
And that started this year.
A year and a half ago.
And how many do you think are on the Apache?
On the Apache, we're probably down to about 150 horses or all that's left.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. Yep.
And do you find every time, what happens when you go out and you passively round them up? Are you doing it or is it government?
The government has hired a contractor, and I know her quite well. She's a cowgirl. She runs a company called Rail Lazy H. She, Robin Silver, and I chat regularly. The issues that she's having is that she sets up these passive traps. They're big round pens with a spring gate, and when the horses trip the wire, they're captured. And usually they wait till there's 8 or 10 horses and they spring it. The wild horse advocates are going around and opening the gates, letting the horses out. She captured 8 of them last week, and they came back 2 mornings later after the snow, and they found that all her panels had been stolen by the wild horse advocates.
I just need to go find them.
Well, the law enforcement has no. You've got a million acres of forest, and they have 2 law enforcement officers for that million acres.
Oh, do you think they just dropped the panel somewhere? They didn't take them back to their house?
I have no. We're trying to find them. We have no idea. But it's a constant war because they don't like the decree. They don't like what's happening, and so they're trying to fight it as much as we can. However, I mean, even to the point now where when she wants to auction the horses off, it's a fight. And she finally got the Forest Service to agree to let her take the horses to Texas for auction. And I mean, there's a whole industry. And if you look at the history of what's gone on with horses, I mean, in the Northwest states, Washington and in Oregon, those tribes up there, they take the horses to Canada, and that's where they're bought. They sell them for slaughterhouses there, and then the zoos in the United States import that horse meat for their big cats in the zoos.
Yeah. No, look, and to me, here's the hard reality of what I'm about to say. Horses, just like elephants, are a sustainable resource that can be utilized by humans that have multiple checkbox benefits. You manage them in the forests, you maintain biodiversity, you improve water quality, you reduce erosion, you still have your horses, you can still go see them, they're still a part of the ecosystem, whether you want to debate whether they should be a part of it or not, regardless. But then you can use the meat, and you can use it for zoos, and you can use it for human consumption. Let's be honest, there's a lot of hungry people out there, and the French love to eat horses as well. So,
oh yes. Well, I mean, even in Quebec, Canada, they still eat horse meat. Austria, Germany, all of those countries still utilize horse meat. It's better for you calorie and caloric wise for your system to eat horse meat rather than beef. Don't tell all the cattlemen that, because they don't think it tastes as good because there's no fat on it. It's a leaner meat, and it's better for you artery wise. But it's become the sacred cow of the United States. You can't touch a horse. You can't kill a horse in the United States. There are no slaughterhouses. That's why they have to take them either to Mexico or to Canada.
Yeah, it's funny. I jokingly talked about wolves and elephants in the beginning and tying it to horses, but it's the narrative that's being built around them. And I know that horses, unlike wolves, unlike elephants, native species, you want to grow them, you want to save them, you want to add them to the ecosystem. We're all for that. We're all for it all. But we've done such a good job and the wolf advocates have obviously done a great job. They've done a great job of getting the populations to a point where they're doing too well.
Yeah, they are.
Same thing with wolves. Same thing with elephants. Like, save the elephant, save the elephant, save the elephant. We don't need to save the elephant anymore, people.
No.
We need to understand how to manage the elephant. We need to understand how to manage a horse. We need to understand how we can best utilize the resource. We don't want to extirpate it. We don't want to make it extinct. Maybe in certain places you do want to extirpate it from certain ecosystems based on Endangered Species Act and different species and whatnot. But the narrative today, and I feel like it's the biggest narrative to be championed in the next 10 to 20 years, is humans need to be a part of the system, and we need to manage the system and utilize the system. Because if you start utilizing the system, you bring more value to the system, and if you bring more value to the system, you care more about the system.
That's correct. And the biggest problem we have is that in Arizona, you have two huge urban areas. You have Phoenix and Tucson, and 90% of those folks have no understanding nor inclination to understand what wildlife is about, what habitat is about, what the natural order of things should be. They like the artificial where they can drive down the road. Their idea of going hunting is to see an animal on the side of the road and take pictures. And that's not reality. That is a fictitious creation in their minds as to what wildlife is. And it's unfortunate, but it's been sold that way. And now with the horses, everybody seems to think they're wonderful, but nobody knows the dark underside of what they're doing across the whole state. And they try to claim that horses prevent forest fires, which to me was the most ludicrous thing I had ever heard, because I have never seen a horse eat pine duff. And when you've got 8 inches of pine duff, that's where your conflagrations come from when you have a huge fire. It won't stop because it builds up such intense heat. And no horse, no animal eats pine duff. The pine needles on the base of the ground, when you're walking through 8 to 12 inches of pine duff, you know that's an accident waiting for a place to happen.
100%.
Yep.
Yeah, 100%. So what does this look like, John? Like, what does the future look like? You know, we're talking now, we've got this management plan, but what do you see? You've been involved in it for how long now? 15 years?
20 years now.
20 years?
20 years. I've been writing about it since 2004 when I first noticed it. And I write articles for the local elk society, and I've been writing about it and intensely studying it and talking to the Forest Service personnel. I've met with Michiko Martin, with Randy Moore, with Anthony Madrid, all of those folks all up and down the food chain. They know it's a problem, and they understand that public opinion, which is why Charles and Howell and I get along so well, carries weight with those elected officials. Do they want to be known as the guys who removed horses? Oh, no. Or the ones who let the horses stay alone? Oh, yes. When you create the narrative, though, that you've got 10,000 smart hunting community, established people who understand wildlife and the ratios that wildlife should have with all other wildlife, sending messages to Washington, D.C. to counteract the wild horse advocate ladies who sit at home and write out those emails and those checks to make sure that that loving band of horses stays together, which is the biggest crock there is, because a band stays together with the same stallion only as long as the mare determines he's worth it. Once she determines he's too old, he's gone, and the new stud takes over.
Yeah, I'm going to. I think from this conversation already, I feel like there's, as you said, Arizona Game and Fish has data. Whether you put your hands on it or I can, I'd love to do, and it's not cause and effect, okay, because we haven't done the science to show cause and effect, but there's certainly going to be a correlation between mule deer numbers and elk numbers and horse numbers over time. And I'd also like to add to that argument area in Arizona that doesn't have horses, and look at mule deer and elk numbers over time. And maybe it goes down also, but my guess is, my hypothesis is that the decline is not as steep.
No, you have to understand the regulation, the way the system works in terms of hunting permits is they want to have a sustainable resource for generations to come. So you're authorized X number of tags. And when they do their annual flight surveys, they don't count horses. They only count elk and deer when they're doing them for elk or when they're doing them for deer. And when the numbers go down, the permit numbers go down, which is why we've lost in that one unit, particularly by Heber, over 900 hunting tags every year for the last 10 years.
Yeah, but they've got survey numbers, as you said. They've got survey numbers of mule deer and elk that we can use.
And those
Who has the horse numbers?
Nobody.
What do you mean nobody?
That's it. That's the problem. The last time they did a survey was 2021. They only flew 1/4 of the area where horses are at, and they extrapolated those numbers to determine how many horses there were. And they do flight surveys that are, number one, inaccurate, but number two, it's a mathematical formula that they use to determine the number of horses that are seen versus how many they determine should be because of a heavy canopy where they can't see under it. That's all they do.
Oh, there. Well, okay. Well, that goes there. You just shot my graph idea down. Thank you so much. Are there units that have deer and mule deer and elk numbers that you could say horses are present or absent in?
I was thinking about that when you started mentioning it. There's a unit like Unit 10 that has no horses that I'm aware of. Unit 9 now are getting a ton of horses from the Wallapai Reservation and the Navajo, and they acknowledge it. Units 1, 2, 3, 4, 4A all have. 4A does not have horses. Unit 4A, 4B does. So,
but are the Indian reservations seeing declines in mule deer and elk numbers? They love to hunt.
I don't know that. That is such privileged information. You can't get that out of them. I wish we could. And I mean, we've had sidebar conversations with the tribal members. They acknowledge that there's an issue. We also know that they were shepherding some of their excess horses onto the Apache to get rid of them. That's a given. We know that. Will they ever admit it publicly? No. In the public stance, it's the sacred animal that is, part of their kinship. But in reality, it's not so much that way.
Well, it's certainly obviously this is podcast number 1, but I've always been fascinated. I watched that podcast, that film that Charles Post and Ben Masters did. What was it, like Chasing Dirt or something like that?
Yeah, that and Dirt Rich, Horse
Rich,
Dirt Poor.
That's it. That was Horse Rich, Dirt Poor. They made that film. 15 minutes.
Well done. Very
well done. Look, Ben Masters is fantastic. And it's it shows that there is this huge problem.
Yeah.
That everyone is ignoring because of the sensitivities around the fact that it's a horse. That's it. Let's be honest. That's the whole reason. It's a horse. Oh my God, we can't touch it with a 10-foot pole, but it's causing extensive ecological damage.
Yes.
And we're not going to worry. We can't look at that. We can't see it. We can't touch it because it's a horse.
And if you talk to the people who are the horse advocates, they'll drive up to the forest and they'll say, oh, look how beautiful and green it is. It is green to a degree right now in the summer when they go up there. The problem is everything's cropped down to the dirt, but it's still green, but it's not from one side of the road where they have fencing and they can't get into the other side. The grass is like 1.5 feet taller on the one side of the road than it is on the other.
Well, maybe we need to come and do like a little documentary on these areas.
I would love that. I would love
How about that, John?
Oh, you're invited anytime.
Well, we need to raise some money. Can you help me raise some money, John?
Well, last year... wait a minute, listen to this. Last year, the conservation groups in Arizona, I went around to every single group. Because the Forest Service indicated they did not have any more money to remove horses from the Apache side. I got our groups to contribute $120,000, and we removed an extra 150 animals with that money.
Wow.
So if you need money,
impressive.
We can do that.
Well, we'll talk offline. We'll talk offline.
You got it.
All right, John. Well, look, man, we're going to let you go. We like to keep these podcasts short, sharp, and to the point. Obviously, I don't think this is the last time we're going to talk. And I want to dig into that management plan. And now that I've got the information from you, it may be worthwhile you summarizing everything from 2005 to today. We may need to say something about it, especially with the management plan being released.
I'll let you know. And by the way, my parting shot, man plans and God laughs.
Man plans and God laughs. I like laughs versus laughs.
Laughs, yes. I like the way you say it a whole lot better than the way we do.
John,
care,
you're the man.
Robbie.
Good seeing you again, my friend.
Always take care.